Oh, again, it's me, Archon888, streaming live on the Theta.tv Edge node again. Came across a video from 2017 talking about the Aboriginal housing crisis. And I just, up here in Canada, and I thought, well, it's kind of important stuff, you know.
You have in terms of the shortage of houses.
We're short 175,000 homes in this country. If there isn't
just for First Nations
investments done immediately, it's going to reach epidemic proportions in I believe in the next few years.
It was only a few years ago that number was pegged at 85,000 homes. But don't forget, an estimated 70% of on-reserve houses back then were found to be in need of repairs. Many of those weren't fixed and are now uninhabitable. Add to that a growing population, and it's not hard to see how the shortage has grown to 175,000.
Resources aren't there to catch up with the need, even on the renovation part. We're seeing houses where they're only lasting maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, and then they get condemned. The list is endless of how, our housing in our First Nations is so deficient.
Why though? Why are these homes only lasting a decade when century-old houses in urban centers last long enough to become charming character homes?
Good question.
Why are reserve houses so prone to mold? Let's address the mold first.
That some of the places that our First Nations are situated on are some of the most, how would you say it? We were placed there by government in some of the most opportune spots. Some of the land is water saturated.
Here's a swamp. Go live there.
People have been put on, so.
We don't want it.
That leads to the mold problem too.
Oh yes, absolutely. In the spring, given that our houses are built under code and such from 20, 30 years ago, and then you see them now, they're built below standard. They're built with substandard material. If you look at some of the houses on the First Nations,
it's a big problem. But what's the solution?
We have 634 First Nations, and if we build maybe 2 or 3 homes a year per First Nation, that's only 1,800, 2,000 homes being built in any given year. Now, if you look at 175,000 homes short, and the number growing and growing each year with the increase of our population, you could see that we're being set up for failure right off the bat.
Okay, but look at how many billions Ottawa has spent on First Nations housing, government after government, over the past couple decades. The latest promise, $550 million in the next 2 years. Why hasn't all this money fixed the problem?
Because the bureaucracy eats up 58 cents on each and every dollar.
And where does that money come from?
58 cents. So 42 cents on the dollar reaches the First Nation.
First Nations have long
From the 1700s to the early 1800s, the relationship between First Nations and the French and British was based on military alliances and trade. The Crown did not have any control over the day-to-day lives of First Nations communities. Over time, the Crown no longer needed a military alliance with First Nations. Canada began to see First Nations as a policy problem that needed to be solved. With the steady growth of settlement, the Crown began to dispossess First Nations of their land. Land was sold and money was given to First Nations in return, but in a very unpredictable and unorganized way that often did not honor what had been agreed upon. Around the early 1860s, a major shift happened in how First Nations money was handled. In a move towards more formalized control, the Receiver General, the government's accountant, would hold on and invest the money on behalf of First Nations. In this new arrangement, 10% was taken off by the Crown, kind of like an administrative tax, while the rest, in theory, was to be held in trust by the Crown for individual bands.
I guess that 10% comes off before 58 cents on the remaining dollar gets...
During this time, dozens of funds were created and combined into the Indian Trust Fund. A few years later, Britain stopped providing funding for Indian affairs. Canada's solution for dealing with this new responsibility? To use the money in the Indian Trust Fund to fund First Nations Crown relations. Basically, the Crown stole and used First Nations' own money to pay for the Crown's treaty obligations. Indian trust money was also used to pay for colonial infrastructure, growing the wealth of the state while contributing to the impoverishment of Indigenous peoples. Over time, more and more rules were implemented, restricting how First Nations could spend their money in these funds. What began as a relationship based in alliance slowly and insidiously morphed into a full-blown project of assimilation, with the Crown wielding First Nations' own money as their choice weapon of control. Disorganization, theft, and manipulation of the fund exemplifies the financial relationship that continues today between First Nations and Canada.
Yep. Now watch this coming up. Member of Parliament
Can understand why. He filed a Freedom of Information request for the government's inventory of reserve housing. He hoped to see where the shortage hotspots are and just how bad the situation really is. What he got was 400 mostly redacted pages.
Oh my,
what was left
it's a
was the
Mar-a-Lago
First Nation's name
warrant.
and its address.
When they black out information about housing, or they black out information about what they're spending in schools, that tells me that they're lying to the Canadian people. And
Yeah, that is what a member of Parliament, the people's elected representative, when he files a Freedom of Information request with the Department of Indian Despairs to find out where money is going for housing, you get a Mar-a-Lago warrant. You know what that proves? Considering where the money is coming from in the first place, and that most of it never goes where it's supposed to, it proves that the government of Canada hates Indigenous Canadians as much as the Democrats hate Trump. And they've hated Indians in Canada for a heck of a lot longer than the Democrats have even known Trump was alive.